Good evening and welcome to No Spin. I'm Nidhi Razdan. The world is battling a crisis on multiple fronts. After 2 years of the pandemic stalled economic growth, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to new worries and it's hurting all of us. Globally, there is a shortage of food, especially wheat. Oil prices have skyrocketed, leading to more inflation. And that has meant that everything is essentially more expensive, leading to a cost of living crisis that is clearly visible from Europe to India. In India, there are multiple challenges of high inflation. Today, the government released data showing that WPI inflation is now at 15.08% for April. That is up from 14.5% in March, and it's supposed to be the highest in decades. This is largely due to high crude prices and high prices of vegetables and steel. The poor, of course, are hit the hardest. On top of that, the rupee has hit an all-time low against the dollar, and foreign investors are pulling their money out to safer destinations. Despite the headwinds, though, The Economist says that India is likely to be the world's fastest growing big economy this year. So what does the future hold for all of us? Joining us now is Nobel Prize winner Abhijit Banerjee, who's also the Ford Foundation International Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Banerjee, thank you very much for being with us on NDTV today. Let me first ask you overall how you think India is positioned as far as our economic situation is concerned. When you look at the rest of the world, inflation is at a 40-year high. For example, in a country like Germany, there's a huge cost of living crisis that is being seen in Europe, in the UK, etc. So how are we placed vis-a-vis the rest of the world?
Well, I think the whole world is kind of figuring it out. I mean, there was COVID and there's a Ukraine crisis, and that's created a commodities crisis in general. So I don't think that, I think this moment saying, we're doing well or badly, this is sort of, I think, premature. I really think we are so much in the moment of a crisis. I mean, the US, the inflation rates are also unprecedented here. And I think that it's not necessarily yet even processed. I think clearly, there's monetary policy, there's responses that are being taken, will be taken, inflation will moderate. But I think a lot of it is also just, at least in the US and in Europe, it's very much a backlog of a very long period of slow wage growth, which with ballooning inequality. And now a lot of people just say, I'm not going to work unless you pay me more. So I really think there is a clear cost push dimension. In India, that's not the shape of things. In India, it's really coming from commodity prices and I mean, we've been lucky, actually. We've been running a very large budget deficit for a while. I mean, for a long time. And especially in the last few years. And I think that commodity prices being relatively low was allowing us to somehow survive that. And now that's with the Ukraine war, that's sort of been upended. So I do think that we're all in the middle of a transition. I think all the predictions about India is going to do this or that or the other, we'll see. There's another COVID wave that could come. So I feel very uncomfortable going into predictions about this is what's going to happen in India and that's going to happen in the rest of the world. I think that's all.
When you look at the inflation figures, the WPI inflation today, the wholesale price index inflation, which is driven by food items, by fuel, by other commodities as well, those numbers today are at over 15%. And the data is a bit conflicting on this. Some estimates say it's the highest in 30 years. Others are saying that it's the highest since 2005. But it's high. Now, this is double-digit inflation now for 13 consecutive months. That is preceding the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but certainly in the midst of the pandemic. What do we attribute that to for us here in India?
Well, I think that we had a major kind of, our supply chains and the supply chains everywhere in the world have already been disrupted heavily. I mean, I think one of the stories that is impacting us is also China. I think China is right now in the middle of its multiple postponed crises due to COVID. And in some ways, and that's that's created a huge number of supply chain issues. And those supply chain issues are going to be, we buy lots of things from China. It's one of our biggest trading partners. And so it's not going to be, as the Chinese economy finds it harder to push out lots and lots of commodities, those commodities become scarce. So there's nothing particularly, again, I go back to saying that we are still living through COVID plus Ukraine. And I don't think that we really know what's happening. I think the thing that's striking more, I would say, is what's happening in the West, which is, I think, a real realignment of political forces. I think the young are unprepared to work, and we see labor force participation rates which are very low, and I think that's actually and unemployment rates therefore very low as well, because anybody who wants a job can get a job. So I do think that that's what's striking in this moment, is that that's something else that we didn't expect, but that's maybe the one thing that plus China's I think many missteps in handling COVID. I think all of that's going to is playing through this story as well. And that's been playing since 2020.
But coming back to how inflation is impacting us here in India, in fact, it was interesting. The finance ministry actually put out a statement and then tied themselves up in knots when they said that inflation in India is hurting the poor less than it's hurting the rich. And actually it's bringing those inequalities, it's reducing economic inequalities. Just put that into perspective for us, because one would assume that, yes, it is the poor that are being hit the hardest with prices going up the way that they are.
I have no idea what data they are relying on. I mean, it seems the obvious seems the obvious, which is that the poor live on a lot of commodities, vegetables, fuel, food. I don't see how that could be. But I mean, there's the rupee is depreciating. That's going to hurt the people who live on imported expensive goods. But I do think that it's mostly almost the poor, also the average middle class guy with a fixed salary. They're all being impacted heavily.
Turning now to the question of the food crisis as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what did you make of India's decision to suddenly announce a ban on wheat exports, literally 24 to 48 hours after saying that we would actually be encouraging exports, and days after the Prime Minister himself actually declared that India would be the one guaranteeing the world's food security in a sense? What did you think of that move, and do you think it was wise?
Well, I mean, I think they're playing the challenges are big, and I don't think anybody, that's sort of why I'm also a bit unwilling to be too judgmental on anything. I think we're really figuring our way out. And I think the question is, how long will our own supplies, we have a stockpile of wheat, which was the rationale for selling. And then I think there's a question of, will the harvest be as good or not? And I think there is some indicators that it may not be, and therefore people are so there's a lot of uncertainty, and people are navigating that. And I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have gone one way or the other. It just makes the markets not trust us. So I do think that it's better to think about this issue ahead of time and then step in. But I don't think that there is I do think that we are really in the middle of figuring these things out. And I don't want to be the person who says, I knew all this is right or wrong, because I don't personally.
But like you said, that maybe it would have been better before making big declarations to to know what you're going into, in the sense that, doesn't this hurt India's reputation as a reliable exporter? We heard the G7 countries hitting out soon after that.
Well, it does, but on the other hand, it's also stupid to be committed to one thing if you really see the shape, or suddenly decide that in fact I see new data and it looks scary. So I don't know what's going on. We have all the symptoms of a great deal of uncertainty driving everything. So I think we're doing all kinds of things which I'm more therefore more interested in the medium run than right now. Policy mistakes will happen. And I think that's just the nature of the beast. I mean, the US is totally at sea as well. I mean, I think there are lots of people, is this inflation going to last or not, is going to have huge consequences for the Biden administration's chances of, winning the election. And we're really, I don't see the same clarity that, we had 5 years ago. There was a confidence that we would, this policy does that. And we don't see that now. So I'm less inclined to be very, judgmental and have a clear view that this is what I would do. I really find it.
Well, that's true. I mean, that's why we said right at the beginning that there's a cost of living crisis now that we're seeing, across the world and in Europe and in America, now in India. But would you then agree with the economists' assessment, which was also based on data from the International Monetary Fund, about the outlook for India's economy? Now, the government here doesn't normally like the Economist. It's sort of painted as a left-wing, publication that is critical of the Modi government. But this time, it was rather positive in the long run about India's growth prospects, saying it will be the fastest growing big economy in the world this year, despite all the headwinds. So would you say that that's a fair assessment?
I think that's probably partly a result of the fact that a bunch of the other ones, like China, is tying itself in knots right now. So I think that's going to be a big reason why India looks good to the world. And I think that's probably fair. I think we're probably going to be less obsessive about controlling COVID, and therefore we'll take the hit. Now, having said that, I really don't think that these growth predictions are that useful. I've always said that, written about it. So I think this whole thing about 8.2% or then there is the 7% pessimistic estimates and all that. I mean, this is just sort of grasping for straws. The BA4 and BA5 wave will hit us. Whether it will be, how bad it will be, it will depend on how bad it is. And I don't know that I think we're going to be much less controlling than we were in the past. But I hope.
You mean in terms of harsh lockdowns?
Yeah, I think we're past harsh lockdowns. I think we realize they don't do anything. We can stop people from traveling, and that doesn't do anything. It just postpones things by 2 weeks or 4 weeks. So I think we have learned that. So I hope we continue to have that wisdom and keep the schools open and generally not panic. But I do think that we're going to get another wave, because I think the BA4, BA5 is going to come to India, and then what that does to growth will depend a bit on how bad it is. And I don't know that anybody knows. So I'm going to be a little bit, I think the economist likes to tell a nice story. This was a nice story in a depressing time. I think that's fine that they do it. I think what's interesting in that story is more the idea that maybe something is changing that's deeper. Not this moment, India, this year, this kind of thing I find that entirely uninteresting and irrelevant. I mean, in India, if it doesn't grow at 8%, it grows at 6% this year, would that be a huge surprise? No.
You're saying deeper structural change, perhaps, long term.
Yes, so the question, and I think they're making the claim that, for example, the rise of the unicorns is interesting. And that's something I've been hearing from my friends in the investment community for a while, that there is a whole group of younger Indians who are starting new sets of businesses with global ambitions. And maybe that's interesting. Maybe what's happening is that there was the generation of the 90s, just after liberalization, who went to the US, studied there, came back with different ambitions. And now it's their children who also studied everywhere in the world and who are coming back now with another set of ambitions, and maybe even more global ambitions. They want to be. And so maybe there is interesting changes happening. Then there is the whole question of, are we doing enough to sustain that? Are we developing the education sector well enough to make that happen? I think we've been pretty lackadaisical about education, and that's been systematic for a long time in a sense. And so I do feel that the supply of skill that we need, is that being produced or not? And I think we haven't solved that problem at all.
I'm going to talk to you about that in a little more detail, but just coming back to the comparison with China, as you said that, the disruptions there, their harsh lockdowns, the way they're dealing with COVID has made India look, much better to the rest of the world. But I think India had also hoped that you would have, with these supply chain disruptions, more manufacturing actually moving to India. Do you think that that has happened with a pace that we would be happy at? Because it seems a lot of companies are actually moving to Vietnam and other parts of Southeast Asia, not really coming to India in the way that they should. Why do you think that is the case? Are we still, we're talking about ease of doing business, but is there a certain non-ease? Is there a level of protectionism that's crept in that's holding us back?
I think there's some protectionism. More, I think there's a general sense in which we are still perceived as being, more controlling than some of these economies. And I don't do business. I don't run a business. I can't tell you the truth on the ground. But talking to people, I get a sense that when it actually comes down to doing something very specific, then it's actually not that easy. I hear that from people. So I'm not about to certify that, since I don't see it on one way or the other, but I think there's a little bit of that. But also I think it's over optimistic. I think just the supply chains are so delicate objects that you shift them very slowly. I've said this before. I think the Chinese, if the Chinese currency goes down a bit more, people will have second thoughts. I really do think that we shouldn't assume that there'll be a systematic and quick move away from China, despite, I think, China doing all kinds of stupid things. I think it's really, supply chains take a long time to build. I've written about this, about how, reputations have to be built and you have to be reliable and you have to, so it takes a long time. And even if we want to get there, I think that the government is actually serious about it, but I do think that it won't happen in a hurry. I think Vietnam has done better for a while. This is not it's not just right now. It's been a while since Vietnam has been good at attracting manufacturing. Bangladesh has done well on some of those as well. So I do think that it's going to be some time before we see big effects. It's not easy to move supply chains because they depend on the interlinkage of many steps, and this has to come from there, that has to come from here, and
so that's a long-term change, as you said. Can I ask you though that how much does the social fabric impact our economic growth and the potential to bring in more investors? And I'm sure you see what's happening in the country at the moment with communal tensions, and every other headline, by the way, on every channel tonight is about a Mandir Masjid Rao over a shivling that one group claims has been found in a mosque complex. So this is the India we're dealing with right now. How is that, if at all, impacting our growth, our in the long run, and also the way investors look at us? Or does it make no impact at all?
I think it makes an impact. I think the story on India before this economic story was largely, I think, in the Western media was relatively negative. I think highlighting not the, I think there's some successes. I think we've done, as the economist says, we've done a pretty good job of maybe trying to expand our redistribution channels, but it was more emphasizing that. And so I do think that the spin is not in our control. And I think the spin matters because people, in the end, they're not really so passionate about India per se. They're just looking for a safe destination for their investment. And when the story is slightly sour, they pull their money. And we sort of know that. They're pulling their money right now. And I think it's, maybe there's a little bit of a self-fulfilling piece of it. So maybe the economic story will generate the optimism, but it's not so easy. Reading the press here, I feel, as an Indian, I feel a little bit sometimes, defensive almost, that, is it really so bad? I think we are in the middle of a social crisis. And I do think that these forces that have been unleashed need to be reined in. And if they aren't, they will eventually clearly hurt us. I don't know whether or not At this moment, people are still making up their mind about India. But I think the general idea of stability as being a key driver of investment, and we want a place which is reliable, stable. I mean, the world doesn't have too many of those, so we're not doing so badly relative to those. There are not many big countries which are very stable right now, and there's a lot of uncertainty about many of the other big countries in the world. And so I think if once the world stabilizes, I think we really need to shape up and show that we are, in the end, stable, we are humane, we are, I think, all the things that we really should lay claim to. We are humane, we are an open society, we are willing to be generous and forgiving
but if I may, how important is it actually, in the sense that, look, countries want to do business with China at the end of the day, which is far from being a democracy. It's the complete opposite, and they look the other way, whether it is Xinjiang, the way they treat the Uyghurs or the general population.
Yeah.
So why do India's democratic credentials and secular credentials become so important to the rest of the world?
So I think that you're making a very good point, which is that I think the world actually cares more about stability. And China, so far, I think this moment might actually be an exception to that, has shown that it can manage it. That whatever, the Uyghurs are somewhere else. There is no, there are no bomb blasts in the cities. Somehow they have managed to control the sense of stability of, that there is really, you can go, the factories will run, etc. And I think China is actually in the process of slightly undermining that by, I think, this sort of authoritarian kind of assertion of that we can control COVID. But I do think that before that, and I think investors, I think it's fair to say, care more about that than about the overall culture. Now, I think India also had the advantage of a lot of people feeling that there is it was a lot of people's shared dream that India would be a success, because it is a diverse, it's a heterogeneous, it's an open society. And so a lot of people also aspire, a lot of people in the US and in many places I know have shared that dream. And I think that also has long-term consequences, that the people are willing to, cut us a slack in many ways. And I do think that that's also valuable. But you're right, investors are often just looking for stability.
And perhaps the fact that we're not China is what has been, what has made India stand out, certainly in the region. Finally, sir, just, again, I don't want to ask you predictions, but is it going to get worse before it gets better? I mean, as we stare at these high prices, inflation, fuel prices are high, the wheat crisis, is it all actually going to get worse before it gets better?
I don't necessarily think so. I think partly we don't know what's about right now happening, and I say that with I'm not trying to be somehow obliquely saying that it's actually worse, things are worse than we think. I really think we don't know what's going on. And I think the BA4, BA5 waves will need to be managed. So there's lots of stress points that will need to somehow be handled. And, I don't know which of those we will be lucky on, and some of them will be unlucky on. And I don't know how it's going to add up. I genuinely believe that right now we are better off, not worrying about our laurels in the world and worrying more about how are we going to handle BA4, BA5, what are the right decisions to take. And I think there's a lot of smart things we could do about that, and what are we going to do about schools. I think thinking about the long-term investments in the economy, education. I really think that those kinds of things are much more what we should be focusing on. I think that's where I think all of figuring out, we'll have to take policy responses and, managing, maybe we'll need to make, if inflation really takes off and stays high, we'll have to manage the social transfers to make at least the poor, be economically viable. So I think we'll have to worry about all those things. But I think that those will do on as we go. We'll figure it out.
Pretty much take it as it comes.
It depends very much on what happened in Ukraine.
All right, Professor Abhijit Banerjee, thank you very much for speaking to us today, giving us some perspective on what not just what's happening in India as far as our economy is concerned, but globally as well. It is a crisis for the entire world at the moment. Certainly, when you look at our neighborhood, there are things to worry about. So let's hope that things, at least as far as India are concerned, get better sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Sure.